In our last video on federalism, we asked the question, who gets to decide on important matters impacting your life? Is it the national government or is it the state government? And we said that the answer was both. And one of the ways that we know who gets to decide is by looking at the US Constitution. And so in this video, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to kind of take a journey through some important parts of the US Constitution as it's answering that question, who gets to decide? Now remember, I'm going to be using some similar sounding terms throughout this lecture. Remember, if you ever hear me say the term federal government, I'm talking about the national government in Washington, D.C. And if I use the term federalism, I'm talking about that system of government that the United States uses, where we separate power between the national government and the state governments. So federal government and federalism, they sound similar, but they have different meanings. So just be aware of that as we go through. Because guess what? We're going to be talking about that question of who's really in charge, according to the Constitution. Who gets to make the decision? You already know. It's both. It depends on what the question is. Decide what? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to see some of the things that the national government gets to do. We call those national powers. And if you look at the slide there, you'll see that US flag. Now, over the next couple of slides, you're going to see either a US flag or a California flag or both in the upper right-hand corner. And that's going to indicate to us whether that's a national power or if it's a state government power, or in the case of concurrent powers, we're going to see that those are belonging to both the national and the state governments. If you take a look at this Venn diagram, what do you see? You see that there are some things that the national government handles, and there are some things that the state government handles. But there are this narrow slice of things that they actually both get to do. So we're going to explore national, state, and concurrent powers. Why don't we start with national powers? The most important part of the US Constitution when we're talking about defining national powers is found in Article 1 of the Constitution. Remember back to that Madisonian model that we looked at in Unit 2. When James Madison drafted the Constitution, there were those first three articles, the first being, of course, Congress. And the founders believed that Congress should have most of the power because it was the most responsive to the people. It was closest to the people. And so when you look at Article 1, it is quite long and it contains a lot of information, not only about Congress, but what they're allowed to do. And if you look at Article 1, you're going to find something called enumerated powers. We'll get to that in just a second. But first, what does it mean to enumerate? That word kind of sounds like numeral. You guys probably learned Roman numerals when you were in elementary school. What is a numeral? It's a number. Okay, so to enumerate something is to kind of make a numbered list. You're actually listing things out. So when we talk about enumerated powers, what I want you to think about is there's actually a list of them. We can actually go to the Constitution and we can read that list of enumerated powers. It's all right there. And so enumerated powers, again, they're found in Article 1. They're part of the responsibilities and duties of Congress, and they are listed out for us to see what the national government is able to do. Now remember, these are powers for the national government only, not the states, but they include some really important stuff. Can our governor of California, let's say, the governor really doesn't like Argentina or any other country on planet Earth, could the governor send troops into Argentina and declare a war? California governor is pretty powerful, but the state cannot do that. Okay, if you ever wanted to declare a war, that's going to be a power of the national government only. And in fact, only Congress can declare war. That makes sense, right? We're one country, we have one military, so it only makes sense that that national government would get to decide that, and you don't have 50 different governors making decisions about our foreign policy. Coining money is also very important. All right, if you take a vacation and you fly over to Waikiki Beach in Hawaii, maybe you rent your surfboard. What kind of currency are you going to be using? Well, you're going to be using US dollars. Why? Because Hawaii is the 50th state. And it doesn't matter if you go anywhere in the United States or the US territories, you're spending US dollars. Under the Articles of Confederation, that was not true. Actually, different states would have their own currencies. It led to a huge mess. I mean, imagine trying to buy something off of Amazon and the seller's in Texas, and now you got to convert your California dollars to Texas dollars. That's no good. So under our Constitution, the US government gets to set the currency. Now, I know this is going to be an example that is really going to get you all really excited, which is establishing a post office. I know you guys all love going to the post office, probably just as much as I do. It's so fun, right? Okay, post office, maybe it doesn't sound like that important of a thing, but you could imagine before we had the internet or text messages or whatnot, very important to be able to communicate with each other. It still is, because guess what? You like getting your mail when you're ordering stuff online. We're going to talk a little bit more about the post office on the next slide. That is a power of the national government. Now, regulating commerce among states means that the national government gets to set policies and really kind of set that baseline of what the states are allowed to do when they are engaging in commerce with one another, when they're buying and selling and trading. This was really important because under the Articles of Confederation, like I said earlier, different states had their own currencies, but they also had their own trade policies, which means they were putting tariffs on each other. They were taxing imports from other states. And guess what? If you want a strong country, it's probably not a great idea to be penalizing people in other states. So this is now a power of the national government. Adding new states is another thing that the United States government gets to decide. And determining naturalization laws, deciding who gets to become an American citizen, who gets to immigrate, all the rules around visas and naturalization, all of that stuff is set by the national government. And that makes sense, right? We're one country. We have one set of naturalization laws, and it wouldn't make sense for different states to come up with different rules for that. So those are the enumerated powers. Why do we call them enumerated? It's because they are listed and you can read them right there in the Constitution. But there are some powers that are not listed and they're not enumerated in the Constitution, and we call these implied powers. Implied powers are really connected to this part of the Constitution called the Necessary and Proper Clause, sometimes called the Elastic Clause, because if you think about like an elastic band on your clothing, maybe you got a pair of shorts or something with elastic, what does it do? It's stretchy. It gives you a little flexibility, okay? And that's what the Necessary and Proper Clause does as well. Here's what it says. Article 1, right there. It says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for executing the foregoing powers. What the heck does that mean? Okay, basically, here's what it means. You know that list we just looked at of all of those enumerated powers? What this text is telling us is that Congress has some other powers that come along with that because they have to be able to make those things happen. Look at the image on the screen there. You have a mail carrier and she's walking up to that house with a letter from somebody. Okay, think about that mail carrier. Now, it says in the Constitution that Congress has the authority to establish a post office. But does it say they can hire the mail carrier? It doesn't say it anywhere in the Constitution. Another example is like, does it say anything that the U.S. Post Office can purchase an airplane? And it's not in the Constitution because airplanes didn't exist at the time. Trucks and automobiles. Think about all the stuff that goes into the post office. Purchasing the uniforms for their employees. I don't know, having a retirement plan or a pension. Setting the price of stamps. Setting rules about what you can and can't send through the mail. These are all stuff that's not in the Constitution. But what are they? They're implied. Through that necessary and proper clause, Congress is able to do some things that are kind of beyond what's just written in the Constitution in order to make that happen. All right, so the pros of the necessary and proper clause, the thing that's good about it is there are so many facets of modern life that the founders really could not have envisioned. Right now, you're listening to this lecture, you're watching it as an embedded video on either Canvas or YouTube. There was no internet, of course, in the 1700s when the Constitution was written, and yet our national government has the ability to regulate commerce and so forth that allows us to address these issues of modern life. So that can be a really good thing. On the con side, people who think that there maybe is too much power in the national government, that the national government is too strong, it allows flexibility for the national government to perhaps do more than is just listed in the plain text of the Constitution. So it kind of grows that national government power somewhat. Now, again, we call these the implied powers because they're not actually in there, but it does give Congress and the national government more power overall. Now, earlier we looked at that Venn diagram and we had these two overlapping circles. And right in the middle of that slice is our concurrent powers. The word concurrent means that something is happening at the same time. Let's imagine that your friend invites you to go watch a movie with them, but you can't go because you already told your cousin that you're going to come to their birthday, and they're happening at the same time. Well, those two events, the movie and the birthday party, are happening concurrently. And so when we use this term concurrent powers, what we're referring to are these powers that are not exclusive to either the national government or the states. They both get to do it. They both have these powers. And there are a number of different concurrent powers, but the most important ones you'll find here on this slide, the big ones having to do with money. Taxes. You know what? If any of you are working a job right now, when you get your paycheck and you look at that pay stub, especially if you're in California, what are you going to see? You're going to see that you're paying taxes to the national government, things like Social Security and Medicare and also your federal income tax, but you're also paying income tax to the state of California as well. That is because taxation is a concurrent power. Both your state and your national government are able to tax you. And governments tax, but guess what? They also like to borrow. The United States has quite a lot of debt, and likely your state does as well. California certainly does. And that is because constitutionally, both levels of government have the authority to borrow money and to spend money. So that's going to be a really big part of it. Now, we also see that both levels of government have the ability to shape your life. They can make laws and they have the ability to enforce those laws. There are federal laws that cover all 50 states, and there are also local laws. Maybe your city passed a certain city law or your state passed a law. Those are going to be enforceable. We have national law enforcement. Think about the FBI or the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. These are national, federal law enforcement agencies. And if you get caught or arrested by them for breaking the law, you're going to end up in federal court. And we also have our local law enforcement as well. Think about like the LAPD or the Los Angeles County Sheriffs. These are technically an extension of the California state government. And if you're breaking state law, you're going to end up in state courts. So both levels of government have the ability to make laws and also to enforce those laws through the executive branch and to have people go through those court systems as well. Concurrent powers happening at the same time. Oh, would you look at that building? That is a beautiful building. Wow, I love that building. Guess what? I'm sitting in that building right now. I'm in my office. If you are my student here at Harbor College, you have probably seen that building many times. That is the Northeast Academic Hall, the place where I spend a lot of time. Where did this building come from? Somebody built it, right? Yeah, we had a lot of people coming to the campus, a lot of skilled tradespeople who were out there and basically building this magnificent building that I get to teach in every day. But where did it really come from? Aside from that, like, how did we get the money for it? Now, when I ask students this, oftentimes they'll say, taxes. And they're not too far off. But the real answer is borrowing. All right, so here's how we got this building. The voters in Los Angeles were faced with this ballot measure that said, should our local communities take out some debt to build new buildings all across the community colleges in our local communities? And guess what the voters said? You know what the voters said because the building is there, right? The voters said yes. And so what ended up happening was they issued a bond. You can kind of think about it as like taking out the credit card and you're borrowing money to build the building. And then later, to repay that bond, what do they have to do? They have to tax the residents of the local area so they can pay it back. Okay, so taxing and borrowing, it's not just something that Washington, D.C. does. It's also something that our local communities do. And again, that's an example of what kind of power? Is it implied? Is it enumerated? Or is it concurrent? If you said concurrent, that's absolutely right. Okay, being able to tax and borrow is a concurrence power. Good job. I know you got the answer right. Which is going to lead us into something different. Did you notice that the flag on this slide changed? If you look up there in the upper right, that's our state of California flag. And that's because we're going to start talking about the powers of the states. And we're going to talk about something very important, which is our reserved powers. Let's go back to the Constitution. And you're going to remember from our unit on the Constitution that we had this group called the Anti-Federalists. And you're going to remember that when the Constitution was being debated, you had this group of people that really didn't want it to be adopted because their main argument was, are you crazy? You're going to give the national government more power? What if they come in and tyrannize us? We have no protection of our civil liberties and civil rights. So they demanded that a Bill of Rights be included in the U.S. Constitution. That Bill of Rights is so important. It's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and it includes protections for things like our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion, your right to a speedy and public and fair trial, the fact that police can't just kick in your door and start looking around whenever they want to. This is all stuff that we find in the Bill of Rights. But one of the other parts of the Bill of Rights that doesn't get talked about quite as much is the 10th Amendment. And you're going to remember that under the Articles of Confederation, the state governments had a lot of power. And the Anti-Federalists didn't want to see that change. They wanted a guarantee that the states would continue to have authority as well. And so why don't we go ahead and read what the 10th Amendment says? And you'll see really quickly why they're called reserved powers. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What does that mean? Okay, essentially what that's saying is that unless the right is listed specifically in the Constitution, we should assume that the states get to keep the power. Okay, let me try to say that in another way. There are some powers that are delegated to the national government by the Constitution. Think about the power to coin money. That is a national government power. If California wanted to create its own cryptocurrency and that's all that we use, we can't do that because we are prohibited. So that's going to be something that's prohibited to the states. We have to use the US dollar or whatever the national government says is the currency. So that's one clear example of when a power is given to the national government and prohibited to the states. But there's a lot of other stuff that's never mentioned in the Constitution. And so if it's not mentioned, who gets to make the decision? And what the 10th Amendment tells us is that if it's not mentioned in the Constitution, we should assume that the state governments get to decide. What does the Constitution say about the curriculum that you should learn in school? It doesn't say anything. So who gets to decide? The state governments. What does the Constitution say about the speed limit? How fast should we drive on the freeway? If you look at the Constitution, there weren't even freeways when it was written, right? So there's no information in there about that. So who gets to decide? The state governments get to decide. So what the 10th Amendment is going to do is it's going to reserve a lot of powers to the states. Unless it's otherwise mentioned in that Constitution, we should always assume that the states are really the ones who have the power to make their own decisions. And in our next video, we're going to actually do a deep dive on the states and what they're allowed to do. Now, this leads to a potential problem for us because we know that the national government can pass laws. We know that the state governments can pass laws, but what are the odds that they always agree 100% of the time? We know that's not going to happen. There are times when there's a clash and there's a conflict. The states want one thing and the national government says another thing. So who wins in that situation? That's a question we're going to ask ourselves next. And we've got one more slide in this presentation, and that is on the Supremacy Clause, very important part of the Constitution. If you go into Article 6, it says this Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. You can see why it's called the Supremacy Clause, right? Right in there, it says the laws of the United States and the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. What does it mean to be supreme? The definition is being superior to all others in authority and power. And so what that means is that the national government has that authority and that power. If the lower government, if a state government disagrees with the national policy is going to rule out. The national law is over and above. And of course, for us, the Constitution is really that ultimate source of law for us. And we're going to look at the Constitution probably just about every week this semester, because ultimately it's what really has the final say in terms of how things are organized. That's one of the reasons why the interpretation of the Constitution is so important. Now, there have been moments in American history where you actually have these conflicts arise between the national government and the state governments, where there's differences in laws. And we're going to see this very clearly when we get into our unit on civil rights and we learn about the African American civil rights movement. And you'll see that there were some states that were very resistant to enforcing federal laws that sought to achieve racial equality. And so we're going to look at this whole experience in the city of Little Rock, Arkansas, where you had the national government after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. If you don't know what that is, that's okay, because we're going to get there later, where the national government said you cannot segregate students on the basis of race, and the state government saying we're not going to allow Black students to integrate into an all-white high school. And you actually had the standoff between the national government on the one hand and the state government on the other hand. Now, ultimately, that ends up getting resolved by the National Army actually coming into Little Rock, Arkansas, and basically enforcing federal law and ensuring that Black students were able to go to the high school and to be protected during that time. And so this is going to be a really clear example of where you have this conflict where the state government believes one thing, the national government's trying to enforce something else, where the national government policy is superior and it actually is the one that ends up getting enforced. So I hope that this has been interesting to you. I hope that you have learned something from the Constitution about that question. Who gets to decide? Is it the national government or is it the state government? The answer is it depends on what we're talking about. And in the next video, we're going to dive even deeper into the state government, their powers, and what they are able to do. It's going to be really interesting. So I'll see you there.